Before I studied fine art, I majored in psychology. I studied English literature and pedagogics, and it was only much later on that I actually realized how much I drew from this in my art making. A lot of the subjects in terms of intertextual references from the English literature and psychological terms often form the foundation of a lot of the concepts that I'm working with currently. My father was a professor in mathematics, and from a very young age he made me aware of mathematics as a language. And it's through fractal geometry that I became aware of the interconnectedness of all living things and how certain patterns repeat itself, and there's a self-similar pattern from larger formats to smaller formats. The patterns of branching within the iris in your eye, they are similar to the way much larger systems like rivers, how they branch out, or how solar systems expand into space. There's this fractal pattern of self-similarity that repeats from the microscopically small to the unimaginably large. There's a dual way in which we interact with each other, ourselves, and with our environment, which involves both creative and destructive forces. This is evident in the way that I work, where I source material, I take things apart, I break them down, I rebuild them, I rephotograph, then I break it down again. So there's a constant push and pull between creating and destroying. I've often made references to natural history and botany in my work. In recent work I've been using much more color, I've been reintroducing flowers, especially orchids. The use of flowers is a reference to my interest in vanitas, or the memento mori, from Dutch 17th century still life, where flowers, candles, skulls and the like were often used to reference mankind's mortality. The flowers in their lush beautifulness is also a reference to decay and could be seen as a life force or something that references fragility and eventually decay. Often the images of flowers and insects and birds and images from nature are juxtaposed with images of destruction, weapons, bombs, grenades, and puffs of smoke, which initially appear to be clouds, but they are actually bits and pieces cut out from atom bombs or war imagery. This is a reference to the relationship between the life force and the death force, which characterizes human behavior. How we have this tendency to build and create, but at the same time to break down and destroy, and how there's a constant interaction between these two tendencies we have as humans on an individual level and also as civilization. The idea of the intertext is very important in my work. That's why I often include book references alongside the collages. Many of the Renaissance artists I appropriate in my work have already appropriated other artists' work, so it's in a sense an appropriation of an appropriation. Someone said, but how can you just use Titian or Ang's work? It's not your work. And I find that quite amusing because Titian and Ang, they were copying other people's work all along. And that's the fun part about working with collage, is you borrowing ideas that have already been borrowed and imitating stuff that's already an imitation of something else. And that's what appropriation is about in the end, continuing the cycle. The body of collage work is filled with both personal and mythological references. I often work intuitively to connect inner and outer worlds. The process involves a lot of chance and randomness. Often I work very automatically. I leave cuttings lying around. I would re-enter the studio at a later stage and see connections. Often these are inspired by certain happenings in my own life that are still under the surface. Sometimes my dreams also filter into the artwork. Sometimes it would be a little bit more consciously, and sometimes I would only become aware of it afterwards. good example of this intuitive process, I was well into the series when I for the first time noticed that I was covering all the eyes of the figures in the collages. But not only was I covering their eyes, I was reintroducing eyes as objects in other parts of the composition. And this was not a conscious decision, but it was so prevalent throughout the series that I realized that it was not accidental. Almost, if I refer back to the mythology that often filters into my work, it calls to mind the tale of Oedipus Rex, that seeing blindness and blind seeing, where we blindly act in certain ways and we see in our blindness. For me, this is not only something which describes my own personal life and my own narrative, but also the way in which we interact with our environment. There's a great extent of selective seeing and chosen blindness, and it's the balance between these two which is something that I think I engage with quite a lot.